Die Before You Die. I developed an interest in death and dying from an early age. I think the seeds of it started when I was 5. It was one morning in about 1959, and I was upstairs at home on the landing in my family home, outside my parents' bedroom, and I remember my mother saying, "Daddy has lost his voice." We did not know it just then, but it was the start of throat cancer. For the next 4 years he had various operations, including the removal of his vocal cords and a tracheotomy, so he had to learn to talk again from the very beginning, this time by belching up air and forming it into sounds. As my mother was a trained nurse, apart from the various operations to prolong his life, he was nursed at home. I was not aware that he was dying. Most of the time he just seemed to be upstairs in his room sleeping, and I knew he had to have his regular morphine injections. Then one Sunday between courses at lunch in March 1964, when I was 9, my mother told my sister and I that Daddy was going to die. I did not feel much like my second course after that, and went to my room saying to myself, "The doctors are wrong, Daddy won't die." Shortly after this, my mother came downstairs to say that he had just died. We were both taken upstairs to see his body lying in bed and say our goodbyes. After that, I often used to wonder about death, and if we survived it in any form. This paper is really just a record of my own first-hand experiences of the phenomena known as death. It was not long after my father's death that I had my own first-hand brush with it. I was about 11 years old, and it was a very windy day, and my friend Nick Curley and I went out for a walk along the willow-lined winding river that both of our houses backed onto in East Molesey. At a place called Cow Common that we used to frequent, along the side of the river there stood a line of tall poplar trees that ran through a pet cemetery. There were lots of tiny gravestones with various sentimental inscriptions to various deceased cats and dogs. In the strong wind, one of the trees had just fallen over that morning. I proceeded to climb on top of its fallen bough that was lying across the graveyard. I had not been there many minutes when I heard Nick's voice calling my name with some urgency. Looking up, I saw that the next poplar tree in line was falling down right on top of me, and it had already reached 45 degrees. At that point, time seemed to go into slow motion, and I was able to appreciate the mottled pattern on the bark of the falling tree. There was no panic, as there rarely is in such moments of emergency. I knew I had to fall off my tree trunk, which again I did in slow motion, while there was a deadening crash all around me. I hit the ground, and time returned to normal. I picked myself up and ran out of a pile of fallen trees. Nick said, "I thought you were a goner there." We walked back to the trees and observed that the second tree was now lying its full length on top of the trunk of the first tree that had been split by the force of its impact, exactly where I had been standing when Nick called out. These and other events prompted my young mind to want to know more about the nature of life and death. The story moves forward to when I am 14. It is a sunny Saturday morning during prep. I am sitting at my desk in my dormitory in my boarding school near Wokingham in Berkshire. I start to write a poem, which was a typically bad adolescent poem called Death is Birth. The poem was put forward to a school magazine, and I forgot all about it. My mother, however, had been proudly showing it to her friends at the clinic where she worked as a nurse. A Welsh secretary called Wynne said she wanted a copy to show to a doctor friend of hers. The next thing I knew was that I had been sent a book called Waking Up by a Dr. Francis Rolls, who on reading the poem had said he must learn to meditate. Dr. Rolls, as I learnt later, had been a follower of the Russian philosopher and mathematician P.D. Uspensky, and as a result of Uspensky's instructions had made contact with the Indian non-dual Advaita tradition, as well as the Mevlevi Dervish tradition from Turkey. I did not meet Dr. Rolls till I was 16, 2 years later, when he taught me how to meditate. From then on, he was my teacher for the next 11 years. I was able to attend occasional meetings of his during the school holidays. Then after I left school and went to art college, I was able to attend on a more regular basis. A lot of the time, I did not really know what he was talking about, but I used to go away from his meetings feeling very happy, and that was good enough for me. In 1978 or 1979, Dr. Rolls did a series of large meetings on death and dying that really inspired me. I would not have missed them for anything. He had been reading the books by Dr. Raymond Moody called Life After Life and Reflections on Life After Life that dealt with the newly coined term near-death experiences, or NDEs. Dr. Rolls said that they were the independent confirmation of his own personal experiences that he had been looking for. He said that the being of light was our own true self, or Atman, as it is called in Sanskrit. He also explained how at the moment of death of the physical body, it was possible for a wedding to take place with this being of light. He said that this was one of the meanings of the parable in the Gospels about the man who did not have a wedding garment, and that each of us should start preparing for this moment, no matter how young. It was the similarity of all the different accounts that really affected me. There is a consistency that for me had the ring of truth. The ingredients of the classic NDE are all well known now, including seeing yourself looking down at your body, meeting dead relatives, going along a dark tunnel, the life review, the meeting with the being of light, and the overwhelming feelings of love and the rightness of everything. Then being told that it was not yet your time, and the inevitable return to the body, usually with a new perspective on life, and an increased sense of empathy, and the sense of a job in life yet to be completed. I had a few examples I had heard of from my own friends and relatives. There was an old retired nurse in Molesey that I used to visit sometimes for glasses of sherry, a Miss Betty Hunn. She wrote down an account to me of what happened once when she was sitting with a dying patient. It was in the early hours of the morning. She was wide awake, when it was as if the wall of the room opened up, and a vision of Jesus and an angel holding a chalice came into the room above the patient. When the vision faded, Betty realized that the patient had just died. It was as if Betty also experienced what the patient was seeing at the moment of death. During 1981, Dr. Rolls' wife Joan had become very ill following a heart attack, and I used to go along to their big Thameside house in Twickenham on a regular basis to cook their meals. There was one time when I went up to her room to collect her lunch tray, and I saw that though very ill and frail, she had this great beauty radiating out of her. After that I had an experience of a great happiness that lasted for many hours, and I was certain I had seen her for the last time. She died not long afterwards. Later Dr. Rolls described the process of her death to me. how at first the most external layers fall away. Personality dies, then essence dies, till all that is left is a being of light. He said that once near the end she said to him, "Why did you call me back? It was so beautiful where I was." I learnt later that it is quite common, particularly in the last 2 weeks of life, for the dying person to pass between the two different worlds. I also heard him say that after she had died, she used to come regularly to tell him things in the mornings. The following year, 1982, I spent the bank holiday at the end of May with Dr. Rolls. It was a lovely sunny weekend, and I swam in the river at the bottom of his garden and drew pastel sketches of his laburnum tree that was in full flower. He enjoyed looking at the drawings later on in the evening after supper. During the conversation, he asked me how I would sum up all that I had learnt in Collett in one line. I said that recently I felt I was transparent. Some words had come into my mind while walking on a busy London street. Transparent, being flows out and loves all. Dr. Rolls was very pleased with the word transparent and said that's just what it's like. I felt that being with him that weekend was like being with one's best friend. You just would not want to be anywhere else. I left on the Monday after saying goodbye and shaking hands on his doorstep. He said, "Thank you for everything." Exactly a week later, I heard that he had had a heart attack and was unconscious. It was clearly only a matter of days now. On the Friday of that week was the final training sessions at Collett House of the 4 new people learning the dervish turning. I turned in the early morning with them and found it very difficult. In the afternoon I tried to sleep in a friend's garden in the sun. I was dreading the evening, which was the full ceremony with a large audience, as the morning session had been murder. Before the ceremony, someone asked me if Dr. Rolls was still alive. I said I felt he was, as I thought we would know if he had died. The evening ceremony was so different from the morning. Gone was all the struggle. The turning was almost effortless. In the long third salam, it felt like waves of grace were coming down, as though in some sense Dr. Rolls was all around. After the ceremony, I felt that now it was possible for him to have died. We had a lovely party, after which I had a lift home with my friend Rupert Spira. We passed Dr. Rolls's house, Waterton, at 11:30 p.m. The next morning, Wynne rang me to say that Dr. Rolls had died at 11:30 that night. Later in the morning, I was cycling through Richmond Park on my way to visit a friend in London for the weekend. While I was in the park, a great thunderstorm blew up. I sheltered under a tree from the rain. While I stood there, I said, "Right, Dr. Rolls, now let's see a miracle." Nothing happened, of course, other than the ever-present miracle that is life. When I arrived at my destination half an hour later, I discovered that the room I was going to sleep in had been struck by lightning half an hour earlier, and all the plaster blown off the walls. Coincidence? I wondered. The following weekend was my birthday, and I stayed at Dr. Rolls's house to look after it. I spent the evening looking through his paintings, in the same way that he had looked through mine 2 weeks earlier. The house seemed to be filled with his presence still. When I awoke in the morning, I felt that some great knowledge had somehow been imparted in the night. I saw it as a visual symbol. It was not a dream. It was something seen with an inner eye. It was like there was this great orb of light, which was what I was, though it was covered by these bits of tatty fabric, which in relation to the great light hardly had any existence. Yet if you identified with one of the flimsy bits of fabric, it was possible not to notice the light. Yet in spite of this, what you are is the great light, and not the flimsy outer covering. It was like a visual image of being transparent. Why not just identify with the pure, unqualified being that you already are, rather than the outer coating, which is really only a figment of the imagination? In the weeks and months that followed, there were many more examples like this. Sometimes Dr. Rolls would appear in dreams and say things that I thought could not possibly be true. Later I would find out that they were. Once I woke up from such a dream with some words I once heard him say ringing in my ears. When the teacher in this work dies, it is as if he never really died, because the people that carry on remain in contact with him. Back then, it did not feel like Dr. Rolls had died. In one sense, he was even more available now than when he was alive. With it came a great sense of confidence, of knowing how to act, and what course of action to take, especially in relation to the future of his work at Collet. Now I see it differently. In the real world, there isn't a separate Dr. Rolls trying to guide a separate Philip. It's all just the vastness interacting with itself in this cosmic dance of ever-changing forms. Inspiration still arises, but it is no longer attributed to a separate entity, nor is it experienced by a separate entity. It is all just the unfolding of oneness. I have felt that great stillness and presence fill the turning room on other occasions on the day that turners have died, most notably when Pam Varley died. She was a long-term turner and turning teacher who had been ill with Parkinson's disease for many years. I was playing the role of sheikh for the ceremony on that occasion. Something filled the room that I just cannot describe, but felt honoured to be a part of. Other turners also felt the same thing that night. I said to the dervishes beforehand that turning had been the love of Pam's life, and this was her wedding night with the beloved. She had a truly great wedding. On another occasion, before the annual Mevlana festival, known in Turkey as Shebi Aras, or wedding night, that celebrates Rumi's death, we had been lovingly decorating the top studio. My friends had gone downstairs, and as I was left sitting on the floor, gazing into those deeply polished floorboards, I heard Dr. Rolls' voice say, "This is all yours now. You must look after this. It's very important." Later in the evening, one of the older turners, Justin Rolls, came up to me and said, "I felt Dr. Rolls' presence very strongly tonight. It was coming through your eyes." In the years following the death of Dr. Rolls, I started writing papers and taking meetings for the Study Society with Dr. Peter Fenwick. He was a consultant neuropsychiatrist and an authority on near-death experiences. We were researching the non-dual Advaita teaching, and Peter was linking it to current neurological discoveries. He had done some radio and television programs on NDEs, and as a result had a large database of first-hand accounts that people had sent in. These were later published in his two books, The Truth in the Light and The Art of Dying. I found these very inspiring, and it all resonated so well with those meetings on dying that Dr. Rolls had done in 1978. One phenomena which was often related in these accounts was small synchronicities at the time of death. I had a couple of my own examples from around this time. I had a pet cat called Bilbo since my early teens. He always used to sit and watch me painting. He was my favourite of all our various family cats and the longest lived. By 1986, he was becoming very old and frail. I used to cycle up to Collet House to do the movements to music that were taught on Monday evenings. On this particular Monday, I was at the back of a room doing a movement called the Big Prayer. It was my favourite of all the movements and seemed to represent the journey of life. From stillness, it seemed to carry you through all the different aspects of life, including effort and despair, until at the end you were back where you were at the start with total stillness. Dr. Rolls told us that it had originally come from a monastery in Russia, where it was practiced all through the night as a continuous movement. At some point in the middle, I became aware that Bilbo was next to me. He seemed to be saying, wordlessly, "So this is where you go when you disappear." When I arrived back home, I found out that he had died. My mother told me that coincidentally he had died at the exact point that the funeral service was being read for Dan Archer on the Archer's radio programme. Later on, in 1989, George, a Welsh headmaster who with his wife Wynne had first read my Death is Birth poem back in 1969, was now dying of cancer in Tenby. They had both looked after me in my early days at Collet, and he had been like a surrogate father. When I used to walk over from Molesey to Teddington, where they lived, I always returned with that feeling of unconditional happiness, which was my touchstone, how I knew if something was right for me. I had visited George in the Tenby hospital and taken him round the town in his wheelchair. When I said goodbye to him, there were tears running down his cheeks, as he knew we would not meet again, at least in this form. I was now living in a farm cottage in Hampshire and was working on my VAT account. A friend, Manya, was painting my bathroom. By mistake, I put the date into the column where I was meant to put the amount of money. The date was 13/7/89. I looked to see what I had to alter it to. It was £137.89. I went through to Manya to tell her about the coincidence. She said, "This must be a special day for such a coincidence to happen." She looked at her watch. It was 11:30 a.m. Later that evening, Wynne rang to say that George had died at 11:30 that morning. Around this time, I had a vivid dream that I died. Waiting to greet me were my mother and Dr. Rolls. My mother was still alive at this time. Dr. Rolls was smiling at me. I looked behind as I felt he must be smiling at someone behind me. My mother said, "No, he's smiling at you." My mother had been working as a Marie Curie nurse, providing nursing care for people who wished to be looked after their terminally ill relatives at home. She normally went in to cover the last few nights before the patient died, so that the relatives could get some rest. She kept a diary of all her cases, that I still have. She often told me about the phenomena where terminally ill patients suddenly became completely lucid a short time before death. This would even happen to people in deep coma or those with advanced senile decay. Somehow they would return to complete lucidity to say goodbye to their relatives. The relatives usually thought that it meant the patient was getting better, but my mother knew that it was a sign that they were about to die. I've often wondered about this, and how it is possible for a brain that has been deeply damaged by disease to return to complete lucidity at the end of life. One explanation is that consciousness is universal, and the brain acts more like a radio transmitter, rather like a vehicle for consciousness, rather than its source, though even this explanation does not fully explain how a damaged transmitter suddenly starts working again. As my mother herself grew older, we often discussed dying, and I gave her Peter Fenwick's book about near-death experience, The Truth in the Light, to read. I told her that when she died, I felt sure that her mother would be there to meet her and guide her across. She started crying when I said that. She died in 1998. It was a quick and unexpected death, from a cold that turned rapidly into pneumonia overnight. I was away staying with friends. I was unaware that she had died, but I do remember the moment she died. I was out for a walk in the Kent countryside, and I was watching the sun set over a hill. It was so beautiful and memorable seeing that great orb sink down beneath the trees and the frost rising in the blue shadows of the valley, that I drew a picture of it later that evening. The night before her funeral, we asked if her coffin could be left in the church overnight ready for the morning, so that my brother, sister, and I could meditate by it the previous evening. It was very difficult to become quiet, as my grief was still at that early stage of the process, where you get hit by great waves with hardly a moment in between to draw breath before the next wave hits you. Later on in the grieving process, the waves become further apart, and the times of respite in between longer. Towards the end of the half-hour meditate, that great happiness started to arise from the depths of my being. It felt like a communication with my mother's true self, which was exactly the same as my true self, and was beyond death and beyond all harm. That happiness continued all through the funeral the next day, and although there were months of grieving yet to come, underneath it all I knew it was all okay. There was also another interesting incident just after she died. Our mother used to look after lots of elderly people in Molesey, collecting their medicines and other things they needed. There was one lady who lived just a few doors away that she looked after. When my sister went to see her to tell her that our mother had died, the lady said she already knew, as our mother had visited her herself to tell her. 5 years later, in 2004, I was staying the night at Collet House, so that I could be there in the morning to help with the training of the new turners that used to take place in the early mornings. As I closed my eyes to go to sleep, a vision of my mother appeared, and I felt her fragrance. She was smiling, and then the vision faded. It was not a dream, because I was wide awake. I opened my eyes, wondering what it was all about. It had appeared in a similar way to how I saw the great orb of light the week after Dr. Rolls died. It seemed to well up from inside of me, yet it was so real and clear. The following morning, when I arrived back home in Hampshire, I found a letter on my doormat asking me to leave the cottage that I had lived in for 17 years. I had by then lost both my health and my work. It was one of those times in life when all props are knocked away, and you are left trusting in the unknown. I had no clue where I would live or how I would pay rent. I realised that my mother had appeared at the same time that a letter was being put on my doormat, and it was to let me know that everything would be okay. When you perceive everything as coming from the one mind, then a trust in the process of life naturally develops. Life is full of many small letting goes, and when seen from a fuller perspective, they seem to clear out the stable and make way for the next phase of life. They also prepare us for that great letting go, the death of the physical body, and one wonders what it is clearing out the stable for. If Pam's wedding night was anything to go on, it must be pretty awesome. I had a friend at Collet, an actor called Tony Anholt. He had been unwell for some time. Then one summer, while staying in France, he had gone into spasms down one side. He was rushed to hospital. At first it was thought he was having a stroke, but subsequent X-rays revealed a brain tumour, and he was given a few months to live. I visited him several times in his hospital room, and one evening I took our weekly Collet discussion group along, and we held the meeting in a room in the hospital. I started the meeting off, then handed over to Tony. It was a magnificent last meeting for him. A few days later he went into a coma. Apparently he had not said goodbye properly to his son. I was told later that his friend, the actor Brian Blessed, went to visit him. Tony was going down the long dark tunnel with the light at the end when he heard Brian's booming voice saying, "Come back, Tony! You have not said goodbye to everyone yet." He came out of his coma and was able to say his final goodbyes. A while later, I was walking along a Dorset beach beneath the cliffs, looking for dinosaur bones, with a mutual friend, Martin. He suddenly stopped and said, "I wonder how Tony is." We both stopped and remembered him. We heard later that that was when he died. After 2004, I found myself living in Dorset. I was still doing weekly trips up to London, and on the way would often stop off to have tea with my friend Yolanda. She was an actress friend who had been in my Collet group in the late 1980s. She was very beautiful and had a lovely kind nature to complement her beauty. She had developed a non-malignant brain tumour in the early 1990s, but was gradually limiting her movement and functions. She had recently come out of a difficult marriage, and life did not seem to be easy for her. It was lovely to stop off for tea, and we would chatter while we demolished sandwiches and crumpets and drained and refilled pots of tea. I was also suffering from illness, and it was lovely for both of us to be able to compare notes and grumble about the New Age views of illness and all the blame that came with that model. Her counsellor had recently told her that she had manifested her tumour to get attention. Ditch that counsellor, I urged. She did. When I left to drive on to Collet, I would often be in the great happiness, and she told me that she often experienced it too after those visits. It used to set me up for the talks I went on to give. There is a great privilege in visiting those who are approaching death, as if in some way you travel a part of the journey with them, and the radiance of a great light warms you as well. She was trying various treatments, including chemo and radiotherapy. Her long blonde hair soon fell out, but her inner beauty and sweetness never left. We often discussed death, and I gave her a copy of Peter Fenwick's book, The Art of Dying, though she told me she was too frightened to read it. Just before Christmas 2010, she was told by her doctors that they could no longer do anything for her, and the tumour was growing rapidly. I visited her for the last time in the Princess Alexandra Hospice in Isha. I held her hand and told her that everything would be okay. She was moving in and out of lucidity, and at times tears ran down her cheeks. 10 days later, on the 9th of April, I was in my studio in Dorset. It was almost 7 years since my move. In a few days before, I had heard that I had to vacate this house as well. I was in a frenzy of packing up my life and burning the things that I could not take with me. Suddenly I was aware that Yolanda was in the room with me. I can only describe it as being like a quiet wind that had blown into my studio. I so wished that she could have seen it before I had started dismantling it. I said some words to her, after which it felt like she continued with her journey. Later in the evening I rang the hospice to hear that she had died earlier that morning. There was another incident in May 2013, which I think was an example of having a communication with a dying person from a distance. Ever since I was 12 years old, I had loved the keyboard playing of Ray Manzarek, the organist with the Doors. I had been so inspired by his solo from Light My Fire that for the next 40 years I was always using it as a basis for my own keyboard improvisations. One night in that May, I had a very vivid dream that he came along and showed me how to play the solo. The dream was so vivid that when I woke up, I kept thinking, but I was actually with him. The next day I heard that he had just died, and I had no knowledge that he was even ill. It feels to me that at death, the bottle of Ganges water breaks, and consciousness rejoins consciousness. In that breaking, and at that moment, there seems to be a connection and a communication with all the people who have been touched or inspired by your presence while here in the drama of life. In the summer of 2015, I became quite ill, which was very difficult. But at what seemed to be the worst point, I suddenly found myself in this place of total peace. I felt so happy that I just did not want to leave it. It was as if there was no movement forward or backwards, just total peace and stillness. At the same time, it was as if there was a massed choir singing one note perpetually somewhere above my head. I wondered if it was the primordial sound. The mass choir continued on and off for a week or more, until I was out of danger. Death remains the last great mystery, and no one really knows the answers until it actually happens. It has always puzzled me why more people are not interested in it, since it is the one great certainty that will happen to all of us. Normally we think that it will not happen to us for a very long time. It only happens to other people. But it could happen at any moment, and in one sense it is happening at every moment. At the level of our temporal self, we are dying all the time. Identities in time arrive and depart with great rapidity. Looking back over life, it seems to have been made up of a series of separate episodes, almost as if it was all happening to someone else in a series of other lifetimes. And yet there is something looking out through our eyes that never changes, something that just quietly observes the ever-changing drama of life and the continual flow of time. It appears to be outside of the drama, and then again the drama appears to unfold within it. It is timeless, and yet time exists within it. In the movements to music that I used to practice at Collet, There was one movement, called the form in twos. It was done with a partner, and at first only the legs moved, then the arm movements were added, then head movements, then knee bends, then pointing with the feet, and finally a series of words were shouted out as the movement reached a crescendo. But then at that point it all started to unwind again. The words stopped, the pointing stopped, the knee bend stopped, the head stopped, the arms stopped, till you were just left with the basic leg movements, how it had begun, and there was a feeling of great stillness. I saw this dance as yet another metaphor for life. At first there is just the pure sense of beingness, and as life goes on, gradually more and more identities are superimposed on top of this. Then at a certain point in life these superimpositions start falling off, until at the end you are just left with the pure beingness again, your original face. In the same way, Dr. Rolls described the death of his wife. Personality dies, then essence dies, till all that is left is a being of light. So in one sense, there is no birth or death, just a changing series of images on the screen of consciousness, and we remain, as we always have been, total stillness. What about the wedding garment? As life goes on, just take moments to acknowledge this great stillness that is our true self, then it really is a case of die before you die, and you will not taste death. To end, there is something Dr. Rolls said just before he died that I really love. We think that we are being carried inexorably towards our death, but in reality we are being carried lovingly towards our birth. That is why we can let go of old sins and old suffering that we are attached to. We can learn to do what we do well, develop the things we love, and have confidence for me. That last bit for me is so important. We are here to dance on the stage of life. We all have certain limitations as well as certain talents, and the great joy of the dance is creating a work of art out of our lives despite the limitations, and really learning how to follow our bliss and the things that delight us. Because when you do that, not only do you have a happy life yourself, but the happiness spreads to others and encourages them to do the same. So dance your dance fully and realize who is really dancing.